I also want to ask you a little bit about communism, socialism in general. I don't think people in China knows what kind of organizations, or even probably don't know that there are communist parties in the United States. So can you tell my audience, and me too, what is the state of the communist movement in the United States?
Sure. Well, the communist movement in the United States was the strongest during the administration of Roosevelt during the
Okay.
1930s. During Roosevelt's administration, they built labor unions. They had almost 100,000 members. They had their conventions in Madison Square Garden. They organized for the rights of Black people. They organized for the rights of workers on the job. The reason, they talk about the old American middle class, the industrial workers, the steel workers, the auto workers. They once had good paying jobs. The reason those jobs were so good paying was because the Communist Party of the United States organized them into unions. They would occupy their factories and seize their factories and refuse to leave. And because Roosevelt was the enemy of the Nazis and Adolf Hitler, Roosevelt made a strategic alliance with the Communist Party. There were people in the United States that wanted to overthrow Roosevelt, that thought Roosevelt was not strong enough. They wanted fascism in the United States. So Roosevelt was under an attack, and so he entered a strategic alliance with the Communist Party. And that enabled the Communist Party to have a lot of influence within his administration. Members of the Communist Party slept over at the White House, et cetera. And so that was kind of the strength of American communism. And during the Second World War, the Communist Party were some of the biggest supporters of the Second World War, and very, very supportive of Roosevelt and the American government against the Nazis. But after the Second World War, Roosevelt died. And many people think his death was very mysterious. It was very well timed because it was right as the war was ending. Roosevelt, who wanted to maintain friendship with the Soviet Union and other countries, he died. And then we got Harry Truman, who dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then he immediately started shifting the Democratic Party and the whole United States into the Cold War. And part of that was crushing the Communist Party. And thousands of communists were thrown into prison. It became illegal for the Communist Party to exist. The Communist Party was just all out crushed. And then after, we had what was called McCarthyism in the United States, which was just a huge crackdown on communism. The rallying cry of McCarthyism was, who lost China? And they argued that somehow the fact that China had had its revolution showed that there was too much communist influence in the American government. They said, who lost China? It was a huge crackdown. A lot of people were thrown in prison. There were some executions. They executed the Rosenbergs, and it was just a horrendous situation. But then after, members of the middle class, doctors and lawyers and some members of the middle class were using the anti-communism to target members of the American government. There were members of the American government that were accused of being communists. There was a member of Congress who committed suicide because his son was a homosexual, and they were going to publicize it. And that it became kind of the fight against communism turned into a fight among the American elite, where they were using the anti-communist hysteria against each other to the point that the American elite put a stop to it. And Stalin died. They wanted to negotiate with Khrushchev. So in 1956, Khrushchev gave his secret speech condemning Stalin. And that was a signal to the United States that Khrushchev was not going to oppose them. He wanted to negotiate. So after that secret speech was made, the Communist Party was re-legalized. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1957 that it was legal to have a Communist Party in the United States as long as they did not advocate violence. And the Communist Party of the United States came back into existence. However, it was done with the full oversight of the FBI. The FBI, told them, you can have this office right here. Everything they did was completely monitored by the FBI. And the Communist Party came back into existence in the late 1950s as a completely FBI-controlled operation. Morris Childs, who was a member of the Communist Party's National Committee, received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Ronald Reagan for his role reporting and controlling the Communist Party for the FBI. And they used the Communist Party to feed disinformation into the Soviet Union. They used the Communist Party to collect evidence and information on various activist groups. And the Communist Party really stopped being a communist party in the late 1950s. Now, later in the United States, there were many young activists who were part of the civil rights movement. They were part of opposing the Vietnam War, and they looked to China as the source of inspiration rather than the Soviet Union. They thought the Soviet Union was not revolutionary. They looked to China for inspiration. And many of them in the 1970s formed different organizations that were trying to form a new communist party that would go among the American masses. And there were many different groups formed during the 1970s. The Revolutionary Communist Party, the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist, the Communist Workers' Party. These were many different groups, and they were trying to get the approval of China. They wanted China's approval, basically, and they were very competitive with each other. But at that point, the U.S. economy was still very strong. You still had a lot of very well-paid industrial workers who just weren't interested in communism. They said that this is the greatest country in the world. You know, we have the strongest economy. We're not interested in communism. America, love it or leave it. If you don't like this country, move to another place. The American working class was very right-wing, and these communists were not very successful in recruiting among them. During the Carter administration, you saw the biggest economic downturn the USA had since the Great Depression. There was a big economic downturn. So these groups got very desperate, and they did very many illegal and desperate things. There was one group that challenged the Ku Klux Klan to a fight, and the Ku Klux Klan showed up and shot 5 of them. It was horrendous. It was called the Greensboro Massacre of 1979. There was another group that didn't like Deng Xiaoping. They thought China was abandoning communism. So when Deng Xiaoping came to the White House, they staged a violent demonstration outside the White House, and members of their organization took the little red book and ran at Deng Xiaoping in the White House. And there were all kinds of things that were going on. And it just became clear in like 1979, 1980, that these groups, they had no success. And so at that point, there was what you call the Great Retreat, where all these people that had spent maybe 10, 20 years organizing, they just said, we can't do it. It's not going to work. And they came up with a lot of theories that said that white Americans have too much privilege. They'll never be communists because they have too much of a comfortable lifestyle. They're labor aristocrats. And so instead, they got jobs in academia, and they wrote articles about identity politics and white privilege. Or else, some of them, they argued that only the black people are revolutionary, and they started organizing around police brutality and black issues, but they didn't want to organize among white Americans. Some of them worked for the Democratic Party and argued the Republicans are so dangerous, they're so warlike and militaristic and authoritarian. We just have to do everything we can to stop the Republicans. But really, in about 1980, that's when there was a big retreat from organizing the broad masses of the American people. And Marxists, they went to academia, they went to the Democratic Party, they went elsewhere. But a lot has happened since this time, right? I mean, 1980 was a really long time ago. Since then, the living standards among the US population have very significantly decreased. There has been a really big drop in the living standards and the life expectancy. And polls show that Americans are very interested in communism and socialism. So much so that Bernie Sanders, who was a candidate for president, he called himself a socialist. He said he believed in democratic socialism. However, most of the remaining communist organizations that are very small and very isolated, they made no effort to go to the masses of people. They simply focus on arguing that the Republicans are fascists, that the Republicans are dangerous, the Republicans are racist, and focusing on fighting the Republicans. And so most of the communist groups of the United States are very small and isolated. But polls show that among the American public, there's a huge amount of interest in communism, a huge amount of interest in socialism. And so that's why, you know, after spending about 8 years in a communist organization that was doing this, we were just focused on fighting Republicans. And having traveled internationally and gone to international communist gatherings like the World Festival of Youth and Students, meeting with communists from Vietnam and communists from Angola and communists from Latin America, I broke with the communist group I was a member of, and I started the Center for Political Innovation. And I called it the Center for Political Innovation because I feel like we need new tactics. Lenin said, if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. And the communist groups in America have had so little success in many years, but all the conditions are ripening. There should be a huge communist movement in the United States. So based on that, we formed the Center for Political Innovation to take things in a new direction. We believe that the millions of Americans in Rust Belt states, in states like Indiana and Ohio and Kentucky, states that used to have a higher standard of living but are now seeing a rise in poverty, those are the people that communists should be organizing. And because of that, you know, we are widely attacked and condemned by the existing communist groups. And many of those folks that are newly impoverished, they support Donald Trump because he says he wants to make America great again. He wants to make a higher living standard. Well, we don't support Donald Trump, but we think that those are the people that communists, if you're serious, that's who you should be talking to. I will never forget when I was a college student, I had a professor who had spent years, he lived in China and in Vietnam during the 1970s. He spoke both languages fluently. And I remember he one time said to me, you know, the American communists, they don't get it, Caleb. They don't understand what communism is about. And he said, if Mao were living in America right now, he would go to the poorest part of Appalachia and he would organize a George Washington Bible gun club. And I heard that and I was horrified. I'm like, what do you mean a George Washington Bible gun club? You know, Christianity is not revolutionary, and George Washington was a slave owner. He said, but you don't understand what communism means in the countries that actually have communism. It means you love your country, you love your history, and you're supporting the most impoverished people in fighting for their rights and lifting them up. That's what communism meant to Mao. That's what it meant to Stalin and Lenin. That's what it means to Fidel Castro. In the United States, it means something different. It's an expression of individuality, right? You don't like your parents, you don't like the government, you're alienated from society, so you paint your hair blue and you get a nose piercing and you start studying the enemy's ideology to rebel. That's what communism is for a lot of these people, and it's just simply an expression of social alienation. But in countries that actually have communism, like China or Vietnam or Cuba or other countries, it is something entirely different. It's about loving your community, loving your country, loving your people, and understanding the objective laws of history, dialectical and historical materialism, and applying them in order to change society and move toward eradicating poverty. Communism, when it really gets down to it, and this is what I think is so brilliant about Deng Xiaoping theory, is that Deng Xiaoping explained that communism is about growth. The basis of getting rid of inequality is abundance. And Marx makes that clear, that the point is to create so much wealth that the inequality among people breaks down, social hierarchies can break down, and people can live a free, comfortable life, from each according to their own ability, each according to their needs. But you can't do that in poverty. And that was what Deng Xiaoping very heroically called out the Gang of Four. They said you could achieve a higher stage in poverty. No, you can't. Objectively, the basis for eradicating inequality is eradicating scarcity. It's eradicating poverty. It's peace through development. And that's an essential part of Marxism and materialism. You can't create an equal society just by willing it. I just saying, oh, we're going to work, you know, we're just going to do it. It doesn't work that way. It has to be based on material conditions. And that's why China has been so successful in raising so many people out of poverty, because they understand this. And so based on that, you know, when Americans say they want to make America great again and they support Donald Trump, what they're saying is we want to have our life expectancy go up. We want to have better schools and better roads, and this country's falling apart. And we have an elite of bankers and monopolies that don't care about the American people. They only care about maintaining their super profits from all over the planet. And so now is the time that we should be going to average Americans and saying, you know, if you really want to make America a better country, you want to increase living standards, you ought to check out socialism. You ought to understand what Marx and Lenin. But the main thing to understand is that we have no interest in copying the Chinese model. We want to learn from China and study. But in China, you call your system socialism with Chinese characteristics. We want to develop a socialism with American characteristics. Yeah. We want to study Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We want to study Abraham Lincoln. We want to study Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. We want to study all the progressive people in American history and draw from our own traditions, our own history, and our own culture to develop a socialism for America, right? And again, this is people that are just feeling alienated from American society. They're not interested in that. They say, oh, you can't do that. Well, we're not in this because we feel alienated. We're in this because we are motivated by love. You know, Che Guevara said revolutionaries are motivated by great feelings of love. We are motivated by love. We love our people. We love our communities. We love our country. We are against racism. We want an America that's multiracial, Black, white, Arab, Asian, Latino. We're against any form of discrimination, etc. But we do love our country and we do love our people. And we see communism as an expression of that love.
Yeah, actually, one of the biggest difference between China and the US is the Chinese government is never trying to push like a regime change or force the Chinese model into any other country. Whereas the United States want all the countries like adapt the US version of democracy or whatever, you know, China has insisted many, many times that every country, you find your own way, right? That what is working for you. And we, China, we find our way. So don't tell us what we should do, which is the biggest difference. Now, what you just talked about, is that part of your book? Because I want to ask you about your book. Is that what it? Okay. I just want to tell you, I ordered your book. I haven't got it yet. So I haven't read it. So what can you tell? Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about what your book?
Oh, sure. Well, I've been doing these live streams on YouTube for several years now. And there are a number of points that I continue to make that we've developed through research and such. And so I wrote this book, Where is America Going? Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution, to make really 4 points. The first point is that the crisis the United States is facing right now is because of the computer revolution. Technology in a capitalist system leads to greater poverty. The greater technological advancement, the more poverty you have. Self-driving cars is something that's coming soon, right? And in a rational society, it would be a great thing to have self-driving cars. But in capitalism, where the only value a person has is their ability to sell their labor power to a boss, that would lead to riots in the streets, mass unemployment. You know, Andrew Yang, who was a presidential candidate, he made that point. He said, if we have self-driving cars, this country will fall apart because so many people will be unemployed. That's not rational. And that the computer revolution, which was a great technological breakthrough, it can't, deal with the anarchy of production, the chaos of the market. And what we're dealing with in the United States is a crisis brought on by the advances in technology and the irrational profit system. And so that's the first point. The second point I make in the book is that when you have an economic crisis in a capitalist society, the rich, those who own the means of production, the capitalists, they begin fighting with each other. And they want to use the government to try and stabilize the economy, but they want to stabilize it at the expense of other capitalists. There's a fight in the ruling class, right? And I talk about Bonapartism and fascism and Hitler. It came out of that, right? But Roosevelt, who was a progressive leader in the United States, he also came out of Bonapartism. And that right now there's a fight among the American ruling class going on, right? And that this is the natural outgrowth of an economic crisis. Then from there, in the next chapter, I talk about how all the revolutions that have happened, like the Chinese Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution, happened because the ruling class were fighting among each other. They were fighting among themselves, and they started to bring working class people into politics as a way to be their foot soldiers, to fight other capitalists, right? And that creates an opening, and that successful revolutionary organizations may align with one section of the capitalist class against another, while building up their own forces. And I talk about this. I talk about these alliances. And so then in the final chapter, I talk about how in the United States, the economy is getting so bad and the elite are fighting so much among themselves that it's only a matter of time before the USA stops being a liberal, open society and becomes illiberal in some way. There's going to be some kind of Bonapartist maneuvering in the United States. And we saw that with Trump on January 6th. We're seeing that now with the Biden administration and the way they're suppressing dissidents and other things. The capitalists are fighting among themselves very intensely. But we should see that strategically as the basis of creating an opening for working people like those in Rust Belt states who are suffering, like people who come from small towns like me. I'm from a small town in Ohio. A number of people I went to school with joined the military. And, I've seen the effect of opioids, what they've done. But this creates an opening for us to build a strategic alliance. And I talk about how on the Chinese flag, that big star stands for the Communist Party. But the 4 stars, that's the block of 4 classes that Mao created, which was the workers, the peasants, the small landowners, the middle peasants, and the national capitalists, right? And it was an alliance of different forces, but it was led by the communists with their proletarian ideology, right? And that what we need in America right now is we need an anti-monopoly coalition, because it's the big banks and it's the big corporations, the big oil companies. They're the ones that want to drive down living standards in the United States. They're the ones that want all-out war against Russia and China. And there is a lower level of capitalists in the United States who want the economy to get better again. There's all kinds of small business owners who have been devastated since the pandemic. And in addition to that, there's a lot of working class people who are suffering. We need to create a united front, a block of different classes to save America. And that should be the strategy right now, is building an anti-monopoly coalition. And that's really the kind of the focus of my book. And I draw extensively from economic research, from history, et cetera, to make these points. And I talk about the different factions among our elite who is supporting Trump, who is opposing him, who's supporting Biden, who is opposing him. Tulsi Gabbard, who I think is a very important figure. She comes out of the U.S. military, but she is one of the biggest critics of U.S. foreign policy, right? And I think she's very important. And the military is a really big part of the U.S. economy. And the military corporations, et cetera, while on the one hand, they obviously profit from war and militarism, on the other hand, they are tied in with this domestic U.S. economy that's shrinking. And now some of the most anti-war voices are coming out of the military. So that causes those of us who are anti-war, who are critical of the American government, we need to reorient how we think about the military, right? We need to understand that it could be the military and the sections of the U.S. economy that are tied to the military that could save the United States right now. And we need to think about how we can build alliances. And that's kind of what I talk about in the book. I apologize if I'm being long-winded. I know you probably have a lot of questions to get to. Maybe I'll try to give shorter answers. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I mean, I like you to explain this thoroughly.